In a quiet suburban town, a series of unsettling disappearances began to haunt the community. 6 women, each living ordinary lives, suddenly vanished without a trace, leaving their families and friends distraught. It wasn't just the number of women who went missing that was alarming. It was the strange pattern that seemed to connect them. All 6 women had been seen in public shortly before they disappeared, but no one had seen them leave. The authorities were immediately called in to investigate, but their efforts yielded little to no clues. The first woman to go missing was Sarah Thompson, a 29-year-old yoga instructor. She had been last seen leaving her apartment to meet a friend for dinner, but she never arrived. Her phone went silent, and there were no signs of forced entry into her home. The police believed she may have simply run away, but her family refused to believe this. Sarah had always kept in close contact with them, and it was unlike her to just disappear. Weeks later, Emily Martinez, a 32-year-old artist, vanished in a similar manner. Emily was last seen walking to her car after an art show, where she had showcased some of her recent work. Again, there were no signs of struggle or evidence that something was wrong. Her car was found parked at the event venue, with her purse and phone left inside. Emily's friends were quick to point out how out of character it was for her to disappear without a word, especially when she had so much planned for her upcoming exhibitions. The third disappearance was that of Laura Johnson, a 26-year-old graduate student. Laura had been working late at the university library when she stepped out for a quick break. Her colleagues later told the police that she had mentioned going to grab a coffee from a nearby cafe, but she never returned. Her laptop was found abandoned in the library, and surveillance footage showed her walking down the street, but after that, she seemed to have simply vanished into thin air. As the weeks turned into months, the authorities began to take notice of the growing number of disappearances. The community was on edge, with residents locking their doors earlier in the evening and avoiding going out at night. Despite the mounting pressure, the police had little to go on. There were no witnesses, no CCTV footage that provided any concrete leads, and no signs of any foul play. It seemed as though the women had just walked off the face of the earth. The fourth woman to go missing was Jessica Reynolds, a 35-year-old schoolteacher. Her friends and family recalled how she had been excited about an upcoming vacation she was planning. She had packed her bags and was getting ready to leave for the airport when she disappeared. Jessica's belongings were found scattered around her house, and there were no signs of a struggle. The police began to consider the possibility that the disappearances were not random, but linked in some way. Then there was the case of Rachel Green, a 27-year-old nurse. Rachel had just finished a late shift at the hospital when she was last seen walking to her car. Her car was found parked in the hospital parking lot, but Rachel was nowhere to be found. Once again, there were no signs of a break-in or any indication of violence. The case seemed eerily similar to the others, and the authorities were becoming increasingly worried that they were dealing with a serial abductor. The final woman to disappear was Amanda Hall, a 30-year-old marketing executive. Amanda had been in the middle of an important project at work when she went missing. Her colleagues mentioned that she had seemed a little off the day before her disappearance, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Her car was found parked in a secluded area on the outskirts of town, but Amanda was nowhere in sight. By now, the police were convinced that they were dealing with something much more sinister than they had initially thought. As the disappearances continued, the community was gripped with fear. People started to stay home more, and some even began installing security systems in their homes. The police were under increasing pressure to solve the case, but they had no solid evidence to work with. It was as if the women had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but empty spaces where they once lived. The community held its breath, hoping for answers, but none were forthcoming. It would be months before the horrifying truth about the disappearances would finally come to light. Months passed, and the authorities were no closer to solving the mystery of the missing women. The community was in a state of unease, with each disappearance feeling like a personal loss to those who knew the victims. The police, under immense pressure to find answers, were beginning to feel the weight of the investigation. They had searched through every lead, interviewed countless witnesses, and reviewed hours of footage, but each time, the trail seemed to go cold. It was as if the women had simply evaporated into thin air. The frustration was palpable, and the case began to take its toll on the officers involved. One evening, a delivery driver named Mark Roberts was making his routine rounds, delivering packages to local butcher shops and food stores. Mark had been in the business for years, transporting meats, dairy products, and other groceries to various vendors. He had made this particular delivery many times before to a small butcher shop on the outskirts of town that had recently gained a reputation for selling high-quality cuts of meat. The shop, run by an older man named Walter Preston, was tucked away on a quiet street, far from the bustle of the city center. It was the kind of place that didn't draw too much attention, but had a loyal customer base. On this particular evening, Mark noticed something unusual. As he unloaded the crates of meat, he couldn't help but notice the peculiar smell that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't the normal, earthy scent of fresh meat. It was something more rancid, a little sour. He brushed it off at first, assuming it was just the smell of spoiled product. But as he continued to carry crates inside, something caught his eye. The labels on the crates seemed off. They were mismatched and looked hastily applied, with some of the names of the products looking a little too generic or incomplete. He had been in the business long enough to know that such things were rare. Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He pulled one of the crates aside and began to inspect it more closely. Inside, he found what appeared to be cuts of meat, but something about them felt wrong. The shapes were irregular, and the texture was unlike anything he had seen before. The pieces weren't uniform, as they should have been, and they seemed unnervingly human in shape. Mark quickly realized that what he was looking at wasn't just poor quality meat. It was something far worse. Panicked, he quickly closed the crate and took a step back. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just discovered. Could it be? Could the butcher be selling something far more sinister than just pig or beef? Mark's thoughts raced, and he knew that he couldn't just ignore what he had seen. He immediately left the shop, shaking, and made his way to the local police station. At first, the authorities were skeptical. After all, they had been dealing with so many false leads and hoaxes over the past few months that they were hesitant to believe what Mark was claiming. But the sheer urgency and distress in his voice convinced them to take action. They decided to raid Walter Preston's butcher shop, believing there could be something worth investigating. When they arrived, the scene was far worse than they could have imagined. The smell inside the shop was overpowering, and the atmosphere was thick with a sense of dread. The authorities discovered a freezer filled with what appeared to be human body parts, mixed in with the regular meat products. There were limbs, pieces of torsos, and other remains that had been meticulously prepared, packaged, and labeled as if they were any ordinary cuts of meat. It was clear that Walter Preston had been running a far darker operation than anyone had ever suspected. As the investigation continued, the authorities discovered a number of other shocking details. In the back of the shop, they found large containers filled with blood and flesh that had been processed and separated. It was apparent that Walter had been systematically breaking down the bodies of the women he had murdered, stripping them of their clothes, and then selling the body parts as if they were pork or beef. The level of organization was chilling, as if it were just another day at the butcher's shop for Walter. He had been carrying out this gruesome operation with disturbing efficiency, and the authorities could hardly believe what they were uncovering. The raid on the butcher shop became a turning point in the case. The police now had undeniable evidence that something far more sinister was at play. But even as they pieced together the grim details, they were still left with one haunting question. How many victims had there been? How long had Walter Preston been operating under the radar, carrying out these atrocities without anyone noticing? The investigation was far from over, and as the authorities sifted through the evidence, they realized that the nightmare was far bigger than they had initially imagined. As the investigation into Walter Preston's butcher shop unfolded, the authorities were horrified to discover that what they had stumbled upon was only the tip of a far more twisted operation. Walter, an unassuming man who had run his business quietly for years, seemed to have a hidden life that no one in the community could have ever suspected. His shop, once thought to be just another neighborhood butcher, had served as the cover for a horrific crime spree that spanned months, if not years. The police began to piece together the details of Walter's life, starting with his background. He was a 55-year-old man who had lived alone in a small, nondescript house on the edge of town. Walter had a reputation for being quiet, solitary, and somewhat eccentric. No one in the neighborhood had ever suspected him of being capable of such unspeakable acts. He was known for his skill as a butcher and had a small but steady clientele who trusted him for their meat. His shop was a local staple, frequented by customers who had no idea that the meat they were purchasing was far from what they thought it was. The authorities began to delve into his personal history, searching for any clues that might explain how someone so ordinary could commit such extraordinary crimes. They discovered that Walter had lived in the town for over 2 decades, with few ties to anyone beyond his customers. He had never married and had no close family. His social circle was minimal, and most of his interactions were limited to brief exchanges with his customers. But one thing stood out. Walter had been employed at a local slaughterhouse in his younger years, a job he had held for more than a decade. During that time, he had gained an in-depth understanding of butchering and anatomy, skills that would later play a crucial role in his grisly operations. As investigators dug deeper into his past, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior. Walter had always been fascinated with the human body, an obsession that had only grown stronger over time. He spent countless hours studying anatomy books, learning the intricacies of the human form. This obsession, however, went beyond mere curiosity. It was clear that Walter had developed a twisted need to exert control over others, and the gruesome murders of the 6 women were an extension of this desire. Walter's first victim, Sarah Thompson, was an accidental target. She had been walking home one evening when she encountered Walter, who had lured her into his shop with the promise of a well-paying job. Once inside, she was drugged, stripped of her clothing, and murdered in cold blood. Walter then carefully dissected her body, removing the parts he deemed usable and disposing of the rest. He had learned from his time at the slaughterhouse how to process bodies efficiently, and he put this knowledge to use in the most horrifying way imaginable. The other victims followed a similar pattern. Each woman had been targeted after some form of contact with Walter, often under the pretense of needing help or an opportunity. He had convinced them that they were in danger, or that they were making a lucrative decision by trusting him. Once inside his shop, he would drug them, strip them, and then proceed to kill them. Walter's skill at butchering allowed him to remove their organs and body parts with chilling precision, packaging them as if they were nothing more than ordinary cuts of meat. He then sold these parts to his unsuspecting customers, who never suspected that they were consuming something far more sinister than they could have imagined. The authorities soon realized that the victims were not just random women. They were carefully selected based on their vulnerability. Walter had stalked his prey, learning their routines and exploiting their weaknesses to lure them into his trap. As the police uncovered more evidence, they began to connect the dots between the disappearances and the unsettling discovery at the butcher shop. It became clear that Walter had been operating with a level of premeditation and ruthlessness that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Despite the mounting evidence, Walter refused to cooperate with the investigation. He remained silent, offering no explanation for his actions. His demeanor was cold and detached, as though he had become numb to the horror he had inflicted. The investigators struggled to understand what could have driven a man like Walter to commit such atrocities. Was it a deep-seated need for control, a psychotic obsession with the human body, or something more profound and disturbing? As the case continued to unfold, it became apparent that Walter Preston's crimes were far more extensive than anyone had realized. His operation had been hidden in plain sight, and the authorities were only just beginning to grasp the full extent of his depravity. The search for answers would continue, but one thing was clear. Walter Preston had carried out one of the most horrifying series of crimes in the town's history, and the community would never be the same again. As the investigation into Walter Preston deepened, the authorities began to unravel the chilling motivations behind his gruesome acts. At first, they had focused on the physical evidence, human body parts mixed with meat in his butcher shop, meticulously dissected remains, and the terrifying discovery of his journal that detailed each of his murders. But as they delved further into his past and examined his psychological profile, it became clear that Walter was not just a cold-blooded killer. He was driven by a complex and terrifying need for control and dominance over others. Walter's obsession with the human body was not just academic or professional, it was personal. Investigators discovered that his fascination with anatomy had started in his youth. Raised in a family that was cold and emotionally distant, Walter had never experienced love or affection in a healthy way. His parents were indifferent to his needs, and he had grown up feeling invisible, neglected, and powerless. This lack of connection had left him isolated, unable to form meaningful relationships. As he matured, his obsession with control began to take root. He didn't just want to learn about the human body. He wanted to own it, manipulate it, and break it down to its most basic parts, as though that would grant him the power he had always craved. His early years as a slaughterhouse worker had provided him with a strange sense of empowerment. In the chaotic, brutal world of animal slaughter, Walter found an outlet for his pent-up frustrations. He had learned how to dissect animals with cold precision, mastering the art of butchery. Over time, he began to see the human body as just another type of meat, something to be harvested, controlled, and consumed. But what started as a professional skill soon morphed into something far darker. Walter's butcher shop became his sanctuary, a place where he could carry out his twisted desires without fear of being caught. The women he targeted were merely objects to him, tools in his pursuit of control. They were not real people in his eyes, but rather bodies to be dissected, examined, and ultimately consumed. Each murder, each body part he sold, gave him a sickening sense of satisfaction and power. The act of stripping away their humanity, turning them into pieces of meat, was his way of asserting dominance over the world that had never shown him kindness. As the authorities began to understand the depth of Walter's psychological pathology, they also began to piece together the pattern of his victims. It was clear that he wasn't simply choosing his victims randomly. He was selecting women who were vulnerable in some way, women who had no immediate family or who were isolated from the larger community. Many of them had either moved to the town recently or lived alone, making them easier targets for Walter to manipulate. He would strike when they were most in need of help, or when they were at their most trusting. These women didn't stand a chance against someone so calculating, so skilled at hiding his true nature. Walter's ability to blend into the community without raising suspicion was both disturbing and impressive. He was a familiar face at local markets and town events, and no one had ever suspected him of any wrongdoing. His shop was small, but it had a loyal customer base, many of whom had been coming to him for years without question. Walter had managed to keep his darkest secrets hidden, and it wasn't until Mark Roberts, the delivery driver, had made his fateful discovery that the truth began to unravel. Even then, it took time for the authorities to fully grasp the horror of what was happening behind closed doors. The more they uncovered, the more horrifying it became. Walter had been operating this gruesome business for years, perhaps longer, than anyone could have imagined. He had learned how to cover his tracks, disposing of the remains of his victims in such a way that they were never found. The bodies he buried were expertly concealed, often in remote locations far from the town. Some of the women's remains were never recovered, and it was feared that there could be even more victims who had been lost to Walter's horrific scheme. The authorities continued their search for additional remains, following the clues left behind by Walter's meticulous records and his chilling journal. They discovered several other locations where Walter had buried victims' remains, often in isolated wooded areas where he thought no one would ever find them. These areas were far from the beaten path, deep in the forest, or in abandoned fields on the outskirts of town. In some cases, the bodies had been so well hidden that it seemed impossible for anyone to uncover them. Yet piece by piece, the investigators began to put together a grim puzzle that stretched far beyond the 6 known victims. Walter's trial became a media spectacle. The public was outraged, and the courtroom was packed with those seeking answers to the horror that had unfolded in their town. The prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including the human remains found in Walter's shop, the detailed journal he had kept, and the testimonies from his neighbors and former customers. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully and methodically carried out his gruesome crimes, hiding behind the facade of a friendly, trustworthy butcher. The defense, however, argued that Walter's actions were the result of deep-seated psychological issues, suggesting that he had been suffering from a form of mental illness that drove him to commit these horrific acts. But the prosecution was relentless. They emphasized that Walter had shown a disturbing level of premeditation, planning his murders and treating them as a cold, calculated business. They argued that his obsession with control and dominance had motivated him, and that he had been fully aware of what he was doing. There was no question in their minds that Walter had murdered these women in cold blood, and his ability to conceal his crimes for so long made him even more dangerous. The chilling fact that he had sold the body parts of his victims to unsuspecting customers in the community only added to the horror of his actions. As the trial continued, new details emerged. Walter's journal contained not just a record of his victims, but also an eerie commentary on his feelings of superiority and entitlement. He saw himself as above the law, as someone who had the right to take what he wanted from others. He had described his actions with disturbing detachment, as though they were merely a means to an end. The cold, methodical nature of his crimes shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Walter had not acted out of rage or passion. His killings were an extension of his need for control, for power over those he had deemed insignificant. The community, still reeling from the discovery of Walter's crimes, began the long process of healing. The families of the victims were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives, knowing that the justice they sought could never bring their loved ones back. For the people who had unknowingly consumed the body parts of Walter's victims, the trauma was deep and unsettling. Many struggled to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded in their town, and the butcher shop, once a place of routine and normalcy, was forever tainted by the dark history it now held. Walter Preston was eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder, desecration of human remains, and trafficking in human body parts. The trial ended with a guilty verdict, and Walter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His cold, emotionless demeanor throughout the trial left little doubt in anyone's mind that he had no remorse for his actions. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent to the suffering he had caused, his eyes vacant as he was led away in handcuffs. The case of Walter Preston was one that would haunt the community for years to come. It was a stark reminder of how evil can lurk behind the most innocuous of facades. The town, once peaceful and unsuspecting, would never be the same again. The butcher shop was eventually shut down, its windows boarded up, and the building stood as a grim monument to the horrors that had occurred within. For the families of the victims, the scars left by Walter's actions would never fully heal. They would carry the pain of their loss forever. The memory of the women who had been taken from them too soon, and the chilling truth of what had happened to them. But for the community, there was a small sense of closure. Walter Preston's reign of terror had come to an end, and although justice had been served, the wounds left by his crimes would take far longer to heal. The story of Walter Preston would become a dark chapter in the town's history, one that would be told for generations to come as a chilling reminder of the horrors that can be hidden behind a friendly smile.